Let us entrust ourselves to the prayers of the Blessed Mother. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. So last week we looked at various moral theories, but now we're into a practical area, and we're talking about ethics or morality at the beginning of life. Now, we count people's years from the date of their birth. We celebrate their birthday. But we know, as a matter of biology, that their individual life begins before that. It begins in the womb. And we also know that life at its beginning, whether in the womb or outside the womb, needs protection. It's vulnerable. So what are people disagreeing about? Well, they disagree about when life begins to have value. And so they disagree about when it involves rights and deserves protection. Some people say that human rights and human life go together from the moment of conception. You know, that's Catholic teaching. Others will only recognize that this human being, a living being, has rights at birth. Or they may say only later on. Well, as Christians, we want to start with the scriptures. So what about the right to life in the Bible? Abortion is never directly mentioned in the scriptures, although there is a strange passage in the book of Numbers that mentions a bitter drink made of dust from the sanctuary, which is to be given to a woman suspected of infidelity. So, if you suspect your wife has been unfaithful, you come here, scrape up a bit of dust under the altar, mix it into a drink and give it to her. And doesn't say what's meant to happen after that, but there's a suspicion that it was going to cause an abortion. But that's the most direct thing. But there is something like a prohibition of abortion in Exodus 21. Exodus 21, 22 to 23. And it's actually talking about an accidental miscarriage. So this is what it says. When men have a fight and hurt a pregnant woman so that she suffers a miscarriage, but there is no further injury, the guilty one shall be fined as much as the woman's husband demands of him, and he shall pay in the presence of the judges. But if injury ensues, you shall give life for life. So that passage says, you know, these two crazy men are fighting, and they knock into a pregnant woman. She has a miscarriage. Well, if she's not hurt, or not seriously hurt, apart from the miscarriage, there's a fine. But if she dies, the man who's caused the trouble, who picked the fight in the first place, he is to die. So, if the woman is killed, a life must be paid in return. If the child in the womb is harmed, there's only a fine. Now, that text, an Old Testament text, was written in Hebrew. But later on, at the end of the times before Jesus, all of the Hebrew Old Testament was translated into Greek. It's the text that we call the Septuagint, because there was a kind of a fable that 70 people sat down together and did the translation. But the Septuagint is very important because that's what was used by the Catholic Church to then be translated into Latin. But when that translation came, there was a significant change in the text, because the translator kind of interpreted the text in his more sophisticated way, a more sophisticated understanding of life in the womb. So this is what the text now says. If two men strive and smite a woman with child, and her child be born imperfectly formed, he shall be forced to pay a penalty. As the woman's husband may lay upon him, he shall pay with a valuation. But if it be perfectly formed, he shall give life for life. So here the text has been changed to make a distinction between an early and a late miscarriage. So the more developed baby, perfectly formed, so, maybe sort of from the 7th month or something like that, is valued at a life. So the man who causes the fight gives his life. Now, this Septuagint version was the Old Testament of the Catholic Church until recent years, translated into Latin as the Vulgate, and then the earliest translations of the scriptures were taken from that Latin text into English and the other languages. However, the Jews of the Old Testament, although they were surrounded by cultures where infanticide and infant sacrifice and abortion were not uncommon, still had a great sense of life as a gift from God. And this sense of the preciousness of life is often expressed in the Bible. And these passages are picked up in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So Moses prayed, "May you be blessed in the city and blessed in the country. Blessed be the fruit of your womb." The angel told the mother of Samson, "As for the son you will conceive and bear, no razor shall touch his head, for this boy is to be consecrated to God from the womb." Job stated, "Did not he who made me in the womb make him? Did not the same one fashion us before our birth?" And in Psalm 139 we pray, "Truly you have formed my inmost being, you knit me in my mother's womb." There's also a belief that God calls us from the first moment of our lives. The prophet Isaiah says, "Hear me, O coastlands, listen, O distant peoples. The Lord called me from birth. From my mother's womb, he gave me my name." So actually he says, from birth, but then from my mother's womb. Likewise, Jeremiah recalled, "The word of the Lord came to me thus, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I dedicated you. A prophet to the nations, I appointed you." In a similar way, the New Testament always refers to a child in the womb as a child or infant. That's the word used in the Greek, not as a fetus, although that word existed in the Greek. And it doesn't use the word it. For example, when Mary visits Elizabeth, the scene is clearly depicted as a meeting of 4 people, not just of 2 people. Now, Christianity, as it developed and spread, sometimes adopted contemporary practices. It accepted eating all kinds of food, whereas the Jews, had very strict food laws. But on this fact of the preciousness of life, there was no compromise. Now, that world that the Christianity was growing in, the Greek-Roman world, at the time of our Lord and the first Christians, it permitted abortion. It also permitted infanticide, that is, the killing of a child already born. The Roman practice was, if a child was sick, or if the family were poor and they were worried about having that child, they would take the child out onto a mountain and just leave the child there. They would just walk away. So they were kind of, cruel people. But Christianity did not adopt that practice at all. One of the very first Christian texts outside the New Testament, it's called the Didache, the teaching, and it's from the late first century. And it says this: "You shall not kill the embryo by abortion, and shall not cause the newborn to perish." So they were aware of this issue right at the beginning of Christianity and said, no, we are not adopting those Roman and Greek practices. Tertullian, one of the church fathers from the early 3rd century, said, "He who is man to be is man, as all fruit is now in the seed." So it's saying, just like there is the seed of a fruit which becomes a fruit if it's allowed to grow and develop, so the man to be, the child in the womb, should be allowed to develop, because that is already a human being, is man. Now, they had little knowledge of human biology, and so there were debates about when the fetus received a soul. I mean, this is something we don't talk about now at all, but it was a big thing, and it was related to the passage in Exodus in the Greek translation, which makes a distinction between the formed and the unformed child in the womb. So, St. Augustine placed ensoulment at 46 days. I don't know how he came up with that. Because these saints, they didn't know much about kind of family life or women at all. St. Thomas Aquinas said it happened at 40 days. So before that, the child did not have a soul, but at 40 days, the child had a soul, and was considered sort of something worthwhile. But he said 40 days for a male child, 90 days for a female child. St. Thomas Aquinas is a very, very wise man, but how he came up with that, I don't know. But St. Thomas said it was a grave sin against the natural law to kill the fetus at any stage, but it was the very grave sin of homicide if it happened after ensoulment. So by calling it homicide, from ensoulment, he really considered that child in the womb to be a full human person. Now, occasionally Catholic teachers raise the question of the value of the life of the mother against the life of the child. And the unformed, formed, or unensouled, ensouled distinction was used in the calculation of penances after sin. So if a woman had an abortion, an early abortion or a late abortion, the penance, once that sin was confessed, was different. But everyone agreed, although they had these debates, that abortion was wrong. Although it was becoming increasingly clear to Catholics that the moral wrong needed a stronger foundation than the Bible alone. Now, in Judaism, using the same Old Testament passages as their foundation, the child has no full rights until it is born. Now, it's strange that, because, you know, there are those Bible passages about the value of life in the womb. But they came out with this thing that abortion is all right because the child has no rights until it is born. Now, Catholicism didn't take that path. In 1869, Pope Pius IX condemned abortion from the moment of conception, classifying it as homicide, and he attached the punishment of excommunication to it. So, you know, as there was more understanding of the child in the womb, there, you know, the Pope came out very, very clearly that killing a child at any stage in the womb is wrong and is homicide. And then that Catholic position was increasingly strengthened by the discoveries of science. So, from the time of St. Albert the Great, who died in 1280, and his student, Thomas Aquinas, there was a promotion in the Catholic Church of the thought of the Greek philosopher Aristotle. And for Aristotle, the importance of science is not based on mere theory, but on the observation of nature. And so that was kind of the beginning of serious science. St. Albert wrote, "The aim of natural philosophy, which we would call science, is not simply to accept the statements of others, but to investigate the causes that are at work in nature." Pius IX's teaching on the value of human life from the moment of conception springs from this kind of experimental science. And it was truly remarkable, given the ignorance at that time, about how human life was transmitted. Our modern knowledge of the facts of life is far in advance of the most brilliant scientists of 150 years ago. You know, now we kind of teach the facts of life in elementary school, but nobody 150 years ago knew how life was transmitted. It was only in 1876 that Oscar Hertwig, with the help of a good microscope, because there weren't good microscopes before that, made the discovery of fertilization. And he discovered fertilization in sea urchins, first of all, not in humans. But that was the beginning of what we call embryology. He observed that the nuclei of sperm and egg fuse during fertilization, thereby providing a conceptual basis. And from that observation, there was a basis for genetic inheritance and settling the long-standing debate on the role of the egg and the sperm in the generation of new life. You know, up to that time, there was really no understanding. In 1921, after 50 years of scientific observations, using embryos and fetuses which were obtained from accidents and miscarriages and corpses, a textbook of embryology was published. So this is only 100 years ago that you've got a first scientific presentation of embryology. And it was actually published by two professors from Columbia University in New York. Now, research continued, but these discoveries related to human development only really entered into public consciousness with the publication of Life magazine's 1965 cover story. It was called The Drama of Life Before Birth. Now, some of you might have seen this. You know, 1965, a lot of us were alive in those days. But, you know, if you look it up on the internet, you'll find, you know, the copies of this article from Life magazine in 1965, The Drama of Life Before Birth. And what made it so striking is that it featured photographs of embryos and fetuses taken by the Swedish photojournalist Lennart Nilsson. And he documented the developmental stages of human embryo. Now, included in this article was the first published image of a living fetus inside, become conformable to nature and morally good. Since, therefore, the conjugal act is destined primarily by nature for the begetting of children, those who in exercising it deliberately frustrate its natural power and purpose, sin against nature, and commit a deed which is shameful and intrinsically vicious. Now, here he's applying the idea of sin against nature first to contraception. Then he applies it to abortion. He says this: another very grave crime is to be noted with regards to the taking of the life of the offspring hidden in the mother's womb. Some wish it to be allowed and left to the will of the father or the mother. Others say it is unlawful unless there are weighty reasons, which they call by the name of medical or social or eugenic indications. As to the medical and therapeutic indication, to which, using their own words, we have made reference, however much we may pity the mother, whose health and even life is gravely imperiled in the performance of the duty allotted to her by nature, nevertheless, what could ever be a sufficient reason for excusing in any way the direct murder of the innocent? This is precisely what we are dealing with here. So, you know, Pius XI took that most difficult of circumstances where the mother's life is at risk. And, you know, saying, well, the mother's life is at risk, but the child's life, if you have an abortion, the baby's life is not at risk. That's the end of the baby's life. And all of this was an encouragement to Catholic doctors and nurses to make sure that they, you know, protected the mother's life and protected the child's life. And there was a huge improvement in prenatal care because they were concerned about mother and child. So Pius said, the life of each mother and child is equally sacred, and no one has the power, not even the public authority, to destroy it. It is no use to appeal to the right of taking away life, for here it is a question of the innocent, whereas the right has regard only to the guilty. So he's referring here to the death penalty. At that time, you know, he said, the government has the right to apply the death penalty to the really evil, guilty criminals. But this is an innocent life. So, you know, there is no right to take life. And he goes on, upright and skillful doctors strive most praiseworthily to guard and preserve the lives of both mother and child. On the contrary, those show themselves most unworthy of the noble medical profession who encompass the death of one or the other through a pretense of practicing medicine or through motives of misguided pity. So he says, you know, the responsibility of doctors is to preserve life of mother and child. You know, you must do that to the very last, you know, possibility. And he goes on, those who hold the reins of government should not forget that it is the duty of public authority, by appropriate laws and sanctions, to defend the lives of the innocent. And in fact, at that time, when he was writing, the laws of pretty much every country did defend the life of the child in the womb, and abortion was illegal. Now, this teaching was repeated and expanded by Pius XII in 1951. He gave a famous, he says, no indication or need can convert an act which is intrinsically immoral into a moral and lawful one. This precept is in full force today as it was in the past, and so it will be in the future also, and always, because it is not a simple human whim, but the expression of a natural and divine law. So again, he's going to the natural law. You know, it is in the thought of nature, it's the workings of nature that life should come to birth. And all this teaching has been picked up again, refined, you know, by Paul VI in 1974, by the Second Vatican Council before that, and very much by John Paul II in 1987 and 1995. Now, if you want to find this teaching of the Catholic Church, the best source is the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Now, it was originally written in French by a group of French theologians. Then it was translated into English, actually from the French, in 1994. And then there was a definitive Latin edition with one or two amendments in 1997. And it's worth seeing this. Really, paragraphs 2270 to 2273. And I know this talk is going to be on the website so people can hear it again, but I'm going to actually ask Scott to put the texts of the talk on the website so that you can see all these quotations, because really we can't go through them all now. But the Catechism is quite clear. This is what it says: human life must be respected and protected absolutely from the moment of conception. From the first moment of his existence, a human being must be recognized as having the rights of a person, among which is the inviolable right of every innocent being to life. Now, this was the first time when the child in the womb was called a person. Before, you know, they talked about ensoulment, but this is really what it's saying. This, from the moment of conception, there is a real human being that deserves consideration. And it quotes from the scriptures, it quotes from the teaching of the early church, and goes on, formal cooperation in an abortion constitutes a grave offense. The church attaches the canonical penalty of excommunication to this crime against human life. The church does not thereby intend to restrict the scope of mercy. Rather, she makes clear the gravity of the crime committed, the irreparable harm done to the innocent who is put to death, as well as to the parents and the whole of society. You know, that's the thing. Abortion is an irreparable harm. You can't go back on it. That life is gone. And it goes on to make comments about, you know, the importance of the government upholding these things. It says the inalienable right to life of every innocent human individual is a constitutive element of a civil society and its legislation. Well, as we know, that has gone, you know. That's even at the time when this was being written, you know, the definitive Latin edition in 1997, already states had gone ahead. It also looks at prenatal diagnosis. So it says, since it must be treated from conception as a person, the embryo must be defended in its integrity, cared for, and healed as far as possible, like any other human being. Prenatal diagnosis is morally licit if it respects the life and integrity of the embryo and the human fetus, and is directed towards its safeguarding or healing as an individual. So, you know, you can do various tests on the child in the womb, but only with the intention that if you do find some sickness, you do what you can to heal the child. It's not to be, you know, oh, let's find out the child is sick in some way and then we'll get rid of that child. No, you know, the child is to be protected and helped. And, you know, recently there's been this question about, you know, the value of embryos. Well, the church teaching is very clear about it, and the church is not keen on any of this IVF and so on, precisely because there is the risk of producing extra embryos, and then, you know, what do you do with them? And it actually says quite clearly, it is immoral to produce human embryos intended for exploration as disposable biological material. So, you know, it's very demanding. You know, it's saying to Catholic mothers, protect your child. You know, there may be a risk, but let's hope that the doctors can help you and help the child. Very sadly, in England now, young couples, you know, who are pregnant, they're not able to find out the sex of their child. You know, that's here it seems to be a big thing, that there's this kind of revelation of the sex of the child. But in England, no, you just wait until the child is born and then you see what you've got. My nephew, who is my godson, he and his wife had 2 boys. They're pregnant again, hoping for a girl, you know, and then a boy again. But you can't find out. And the reason for this is that they noticed a lot of Indian families, and there are a lot of Indians in Britain coming from, you know, what was the British Empire. They were using the test to find out whether it was a boy or a girl. And if it was a girl, they asked for an abortion, because they were so fixed on having a boy. And then they would say, oh, well, we don't want this girl, you know. And of course, you know, even the government, the civil government, realized that's completely wrong. So no more tests to find out what sex the child is. Now, that's Catholic teaching. But of course, you've got other people who are thinking in a different way. And we looked at the theory of utilitarianism. The end justifies the means. In other words, you can do anything if you get a good result. And the great spokesman for utilitarianism these days is a man called Peter Singer, born in 1946. He's Australian. He's now professor of bioethics at Princeton University. Now, he agrees with pro-lifers that the embryo or the fetus is a living human being. You can't deny that. I mean, it's simple science, you know. There are cells developing, it's living, it's human. But he doesn't say, what he says is, human life is not necessarily sacred. And in 1995, he wrote a famous article in a London magazine, The Spectator, and the title of it was, "Killing Babies Isn't Always Wrong." Can you imagine that? Killing babies isn't always wrong. But that's looking at it from a utilitarian point of view. So he says, life has to be protected when it's a real person. And he says, you know, what makes a person is that you are rational, you're self-aware, you have desires for the future, and you're independent. So he says babies in the womb and even newborn babies do not have those qualities. They're obviously not independent. And he refers approvingly to the ancient societies which permitted infanticide, the killing of children. And he says societies which selected who will be allowed to become a member of the community and who will not. So he says, if a child is not wanted, it is not wrong to take its life. So Singer admits that, you know, this is a human being, but he says it's not a human person. And so he says, Singer, so abortion and infanticide are also justified as methods even of curbing overpopulation. So you've got too many people in your society, you know, you can use abortion, or you look at these children who've been born and you say, well, that's a good one, that one's not so good, so, you know, these ones we keep, those ones go out. And, of course, he says on utilitarian, which is, you know, looking at what will cause people to be happiest, you have to take into account the preferences of the woman, because the woman is a real person, but the baby in the womb or even the newborn child is not a full person. So he says, the essential characteristics of personhood, rationality, autonomy, self-consciousness, are lacking in a newborn child. And therefore, he says, killing a newborn baby is never equivalent to killing a person. That is, a being who wants to go on living. So he says, the baby doesn't even know if it wants to go on living. So you can do whatever you want with it. Now, obviously, to us, that's pretty horrific. And he concludes by saying, I believe it should be possible to carry out the decision to take the baby's life, not only by withholding or withdrawing life support, you know, by taking away all nourishment, you know, he says, well, that might make the baby suffer because it would be dehydrated. But he also says, so it would be all right to take active steps to end the baby's life swiftly and humanely. So remember, for Catholics, every life, newborn or not yet born, has its own value. And, you know, but that is what we are struggling against, this utilitarian view, you know? And under that utilitarian view here in America, so many lives have been taken, millions and millions of lives. And, rightly, we remember that every year. We always have a special Mass every year for the protection of human life. Well, most of us, we survived those early years. Luckily, they didn't throw us out. Here we are. But we're coming up to the end of our lives. And next week, we're looking at the ethics at the end of